The hum of automobile engines and the subdued light of street lamps created the atmosphere of an ordinary evening in Chicago. The city lived its own life. The workday had changed to nighttime bustle. Restaurants opened their doors to latecomers, and neon signs reflected on the damp asphalt. A stream of cars moved rhythmically through the streets, and the occasional sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. In a small diner on the edge of downtown, Officer Glenn Harper was finishing his coffee. He absent-mindedly tapped his fingers on the table, running his eyes over the headlines of the latest issue of the Chicago Tribune. A tall, sturdy man in his early 40s, he had long since lost his youthful idealism, replacing it with cynicism. 2 decades of service had left their mark. Harper believed he knew who was a threat, and more than once had allowed himself to go beyond the law, justifying it as a matter of duty. After paying, he tossed the meager tip on the table and stepped out into the cool fall evening. Pulling up the collar of his jacket, the officer headed for his patrol car. His movements read fatigue, but his eyes burned with impatience. He wasn't after real criminals. It was enough for him to feel power over those he felt didn't belong on these streets. Meanwhile, in another part of town, 29-year-old Camille Robinson was returning home from a late-night meeting with a civil rights group. She had been appointed interim judge 2 days earlier, and was now one of the youngest women in Cook County history to hold such a high office. Her name was already buzzing in legal circles, and her reputation as an unyielding fighter for justice foreshadowed a resounding change. Camille sighed tiredly, but emotions were still stirring inside. She had just discussed strategies to reduce recidivism among young people. Her head was full of plans, but right now, all she wanted to do was get home. She drove her old Toyota Camry through the narrow streets of the northern part of the city, enjoying the smooth sounds of jazz coming from the speakers. But the feeling of tranquility was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, she spotted a patrol car. Camille's heart clenched. She knew the neighborhood. Black drivers were often stopped here. She was sure she hadn't broken any rules, but anxiety crept into her soul. A few seconds later, the street lit up with flashes of red and blue lights, and the sharp sound of a siren broke the silence of the night. Camille took a deep breath. Her mind automatically scrolled through the algorithm of actions. Shut off the engine, keep her hands in sight, speak calmly. She hadn't done anything reprehensible, but she knew all too well how such stops could end. She carefully pulled off to the side of the road, turning on her turn signal. With trembling fingers, she pulled her driver's license, insurance, and registration out of the glove compartment. A moment later, the tall silhouette of an officer appeared next to her window. "Good evening, officer," she said in a steady voice, trying to keep her composure. "What's the reason for the stop?" Harper looked at her coldly, his eyes glancing appraisingly around the interior of the car. "Driver's license and registration," he said briefly, ignoring her question. Camille silently handed over the documents. Her fingers were tense, but she wouldn't let her excitement show. Harper took the papers and, without a word, walked back to the patrol car. The minutes dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Camille looked at her watch. 10:25. Anxiety grew inside her. Finally, the officer reappeared at the window. This time, his expression was even more rigid. "Are you in a hurry?" asked ma'am. His voice was imbued with suspicion. "No, not really." Camille replied calmly, looking him straight in the eye. Is something wrong? There was a tense silence. He seemed to be waiting for her to say or do something wrong. There was an unfounded accusation hanging in the air, one that defied logic but was so familiar to those who faced bias. You took too wide a turn, Harper said at last, but there was no firmness in his voice. Get out of the car. A cold lump clenched in Camille's chest, but on the outside she remained unfazed. She knew her rights. Officer, am I under arrest? She asked clearly. Harper squinted his eyes, bowing his head irritably. Camille could feel the tension thickening, as if a thunderstorm were about to break over their heads. She wasn't going to obey without reason, but she didn't want to provoke conflict. Every move she made, every word she said, was under the scrutiny of a man who was used to not tolerating objections. This night was the beginning of a clash that would change their lives forever. But neither of them knew that soon their paths would cross again, in a courtroom where Camille Robinson would enter the courtroom not as the accused, but as the one who administered justice. Camille Robinson drove through the Chicago night, trying to calm down after her encounter with Officer Harper. Her heart was still beating fast, and a mixture of anger and helplessness boiled in her chest. She knew she'd done the right thing, complied with the law, but that didn't save her from humiliation. Moments like this reminded her why she had chosen a career in law and why now, on the eve of her new role as a judge, she would have to fight not only for justice, but for change. In her apartment, she slowly removed her shoes, sank down on the couch, and stared at the wall. Thoughts swarmed in her head. She could file a complaint, but she knew how hard it was to get justice in situations like this. Tomorrow, she was to meet with her mentor/Judge Sarita Hill. Perhaps she could tell her what to do. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Glenn Harper sat in his living room with a bottle of beer. The TV was showing a sports channel on the air, but he wasn't paying attention to the screen. His thoughts kept returning to the traffic stop. He felt annoyed. That woman. There was something about her that made him angry. She wasn't scared, she wasn't confused. She wasn't begging. He was used to different. He didn't like it when people he was used to controlling questioned him. He threw the bottle on the table and went to bed, not even realizing that he would soon run into Camilla again, but in a very different setting. The next morning, Camilla entered Judge Hill's office, smiling demurely at her mentor. The latter looked at her carefully, immediately noticing her tension. "You look troubled," Hill remarked, gesturing for Camilla to sit down. "Is something wrong?" Camilla sighed, and one gathering her courage, recounted the events of the previous night. Judge Hill listened in silence, her face impenetrable, but her eyes flashed with that familiar flame of righteous anger. "And you're not just going to let it go, are you?" she finally asked. "No," Camilla answered confidently. "But I want to approach this intelligently. If I file a complaint now, before I officially take office, it could be used against me. But if I wait for the right time, then you'll have the power to change the system from within." Hill nodded, understanding Camilla's train of thought. "You're smart, Camille. But be careful. Officers like Harper don't just change." The next few days flew by in preparation for the assignment ceremony. Camilla tried not to think about Harper, but the memory of his sneer never left her mind. Her judicial appointment wasn't just a career move, it was a chance to fight back against the likes of him. Finally, the day of the ceremony arrived. Camilla was introduced to the public as the new circuit court judge, and she proudly recited the oath of office. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped up to the podium, looking out into a room filled with co-workers, friends, and community members. She knew this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Officer Harper, going about his usual business, had no idea that very soon he would find himself in that very courtroom, not as a defender of order, but as a defendant. His habit of abusing his power was going to backfire on him one day. He just didn't expect retribution to be so swift. That night, neither Camilla nor Harper slept. She because of a sense of injustice, he because of an irritation he couldn't quite explain. Remembering her confident voice, the calmness with which she asked questions, and her look of indignation rather than fear, he felt strangely uneasy. He didn't like it when anyone, especially someone like her, dared to question him. But he convinced himself again that he had done the right thing. He always found justification for his actions, even if they were dictated not by law but by prejudice. The morning light filtered through the curtains, and Camille woke up earlier than usual. She knew she couldn't just let what had happened go. Hours later, she was sitting in a cozy cafe near City Hall, across from her friend and only ally in the police force, Detective Helena Rosales. "Cam, are you okay?" Helena asked, noticing the tense expression on her face. Camille took a sip of coffee and took a deep breath. "Last night I was pulled over by an officer named Glenn Harper. For no reason. He was being aggressive." Helena's face tensed up. "Harper. His name sounds familiar. There were complaints, but nothing went to disciplinary action. There wasn't enough evidence." Camilla shook her head. "Here's the problem. People like him work with impunity because no one can hold them accountable. I'm thinking of filing a complaint, but I don't want it to become a political scandal before my appointment." "Or are you afraid it will make you a target?" Helena guessed. Camilla nodded silently. "Let me know if you decide to act," Helena said. "I'll help." The next few days flew by in preparation for the appointment ceremony. Camille tried to focus on her new duties, but the memory of her unjust detention kept her busy. Meanwhile, Harper continued his patrols, unaware that he would soon encounter the woman he had humiliated, but now on her turf. The day of the swearing-in came. Friends/family and community leaders gathered in the courtroom of the Cook County Courthouse. Judge Sarita Hill gave a solemn speech. "Today we welcome Camille Robinson Sott, a brilliant lawyer dedicated to justice. There is no doubt that she will serve the community honorably." As Camille donned the robe of justice, she felt the weight of responsibility, but also the power that was now in her hands. After the ceremony, colleagues, professors, and activists came up to congratulate her. Among them was Helena, who smiled at her with pride. A week later, Camille took her seat in court. Her first summons included minor offenses, traffic violations/petty theft. Her goal was to give everyone a fair chance. By late afternoon, she was tiredly reviewing the next case when the clerk announced, "State of Illinois v. Officer Glenn Harper." Camille looked up, and her heart sank. Fate had brought them together again, but now in a courtroom, on her turf. Camille froze for a moment, her heart hammering so loudly it felt as if everyone in the room could hear it. She lowered her gaze to the file, her fingers clenched on the folder. A preliminary hearing for an alleged abuse of authority by a police officer, escalating to criminal charges. The officer was accused of using excessive force in an arrest, and the case had come into her courtroom because of a change in scheduling. She clenched her teeth, her breath catching when she saw the defendant's name, Glenn Harper. The same cop who'd pulled her over that night. She forced herself to keep her composure. There were clear rules in the practice of law. If a judge had personal motives or ties to a case, he or she was required to recuse themselves. Yet something inside her protested. She knew that people like Harper were used to evading responsibility. How many other people had suffered at his hands? How many who didn't know their rights and couldn't defend themselves? Your Honor, Prosecutor Adrian Lowe, a trim man with a sharp eye, stepped to the pulpit. Before you is the case of Officer Glenn Harper, charged with assault in the line of duty. The victim alleges that the stop was unreasonable and the use of force resulted in serious injury. Camilla slowly raised her eyes to the defendant. Harper sat at the defense table, intense but still as cocky. He looked different in a suit rather than a uniform, but still she saw him as the kind of man who abused his power. He glanced at her, his eyebrows subtly shifting as if he was trying to remember where he knew her from. Camilla cleared her throat. Officer Harper. Her voice was steady and firm. You will stand trial on charges of abuse of authority. This hearing will determine if there is enough evidence to take the case to trial. Do you have an attorney? Harper's attorney, Laz, a gray-haired man with shrewd eyes, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. My name is Richard Cohen / and my client pleads not guilty. We insist on an immediate review of the evidence. The officer acted within his authority. Camilla only nodded slightly. Prosecutor, please state the facts of the case. Lowe summarized the charges, stopping a car for questionable reasons, the use of brute force resulting in a broken arm on the victim, an elderly teacher named Malcolm Harris. Eyewitnesses captured part of the incident on a cell phone camera. As the prosecutor was listing the details, Camilla felt her fingers clench into a fist under the table. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a system. And she wasn't just sitting here as a judge, but as someone who knew what Harper was capable of. She blew out a breath. She had to remain impartial. Defense, she turned to Cohen. The lawyer began talking confidently about how his client had every right to use force, that Harris had allegedly fought back, that the video didn't convey the whole picture. Harper sat without taking his eyes off Camilla. She could feel his intense scrutiny and wondered if he recognized her. After the opening statements were completed, Camilla made her decision. The meeting is adjourned until tomorrow. We will hear the witnesses and examine the video evidence. Court is adjourned. She banged the gavel, and the hall filled with the hum of people gathering. Harper hesitated before walking out, his gaze lingering on Camilla a little longer than necessary. She turned away, hiding her thoughts behind a mask of judicial calm. In her office, she couldn't calm down. She knew she had to consider recusal, but that meant handing the case over to another judge, perhaps one who wouldn't be so critical of what the defense was saying. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number. Helena. Her voice was steady, but her insides were seething. We need to talk. Half an hour later, her friend was sitting across from her, arms crossed over her chest, listening to Camilla with intense attention. It's complicated, she said finally. It's up to you. If your stop had been officially documented, you wouldn't have a choice. But as it is, you have the right to run the trial. The question is, can you remain impartial? Camilla rubbed her temples. If I take this case to another judge, Harper can get away with it again. But if I keep it, someone could say I made the decision out of personal animosity. What's the right thing for me to do? Helena looked at her carefully. You already know the answer. The question is whether you have the courage to accept it. Camilla froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She stared at the court file, the defendant's name catching her eye. Officer Glenn Harper. The same man who'd pulled her over that night. Now he was charged with abuse of authority and grievous bodily harm. The case had landed on her desk because of a reassignment of trials in court. She knew her duty as a judge demanded impartiality. If she admitted a personal connection to the defendant, she would have to recuse herself. But, on the other hand, if she recused herself, the case could go to a judge less inclined to discern its true nature. The next day, the hearing began. The prosecution presented a videotape taken by a passerby. It showed Harper forcefully pinning an elderly African-American man against the hood of a patrol car, twisting his arm. The victim, Malcolm Harris, a former school teacher, described how the stop began with a routine question about a broken taillight, but quickly turned into aggression from the officer. Harper sat at the defense table while tense, but not losing confidence. When it was his turn to speak, he argued that the man had allegedly reached for a gun, and he had acted in self-defense. Camilla listened attentively, but there was no remorse or doubt in his voice, just a well-rehearsed version of events. After the meeting was over, Camilla returned to her chambers. Her mind tossed between professional duty and personal memories. But the facts spoke for themselves. The recording / the testimony / the medical report. Everything pointed to sufficient grounds for a trial. As she re-entered the room, a realization flashed in Harper's eyes. He remembered her. But now Camilla wasn't the frightened woman on the road. She was the judge making decisions. On the basis of the evidence presented, the court orders that the case be remanded to a higher court, she announced. Harper clenched his jaw. His lawyer immediately stepped up, demanding a private interview. But Camilla made it clear further motions must be made on the record. The next morning, an assistant walked into her office with unexpected news. Harper's case had been assigned to her. Because of the court's congestion, the random assignment system had left the trial under her jurisdiction. She froze. A full trial meant weeks of hearings, cross-examinations, intense media attention. She glanced at her phone. A message from Helena. He's figured out who you are. Be careful. Camilla realized if she dropped the case now, it would arouse suspicion. If she stayed, the defense would try to accuse her of bias. She decided to discuss the situation with Judge Sarita Hill / a mentor whose opinion she valued. After listening to Camilla, Hill nodded. It's a difficult situation. You have an obligation to be impartial. You have a personal history with the defendant, but there's been no formal complaint. You're not technically connected to the case. But I know what he did, Camilla muttered. Yes, / and that complicates things. But the question is different. Can you reach a fair verdict based on the facts alone? Or will the past influence your decision? Hill squinted. Camilla took a deep breath. She knew that the answer to this question would determine her future, not only as a judge, but also as a person seeking justice. Camille took a deep breath as she looked at Judge Sarita Hill, her mentor. If you're confident you can maintain objectivity, stay. But if you feel for even a second that your emotions are influencing the decision, you better back off, the judge said, watching Camille closely. Camille nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. I will see this case through to the end, but if I realize I am failing, I will step down. A week later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed, journalists, activists, the curious. Officer Harper appeared in an elegant suit, but his face remained tense. His lawyer looked confident, clearly expecting to discredit the prosecution's witnesses. Prosecutor Adrian Lowe began with a powerful opening statement, detailing the evidence against Harper, the videotape, Malcolm Harris's medical records, eyewitness testimony. He painted a picture of an officer abusing his power. The defense, for its part, insisted the charge was exaggerated and Harper was acting within the scope of his duties. Camille kept her cool / making sure due process was followed. The jury listened intently, taking notes. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Harper had other complaints behind him, albeit unofficial. A key witness was Isaiah Turner, who saw Harper treat Harris rudely and heard insulting words directed at him. The defense tried to discredit him by pointing to his criminal record, but Camille limited that questioning. Day after day, Camille went home emotionally exhausted. She tried to separate the personal from the professional, but the thought of her own meeting with Harper never left her. The moment came when Harper himself took the witness stand. He asserted that he had feared for his life when Harris reached into the glove compartment and that the force used was justified. However, the videotape did not show this. Prosecutor Lowe conducted a vicious cross-examination. Your report says Mr. Harris attacked you. However, Haas says so. The video doesn't show that. How do you explain that? He asked. Harper hesitated. It was a small but important gesture. Maybe the camera didn't capture it. The jury grew wary. Harper seemed confused by his own words. The closing speeches sounded tense. Lowe reminded the jury that this trial is about justice, about a system in which no one is above the law. The defense, on the other hand, insisted on the complexities of police work and distrust of parts of the evidence. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours passed / then days. Tension in the courtroom was rising. Reporters scrambled for any news, and Camille inwardly prepared for any outcome. Finally, the message came. We have reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Everyone held their breath as the foreman of the jury stood up, holding up the decision sheet. Imagine that overnight your life is turned upside down. You get off work, tired but satisfied with the job you've done, and suddenly find yourself surrounded by flashing police lights. The officers are calling your name. Their voices are harsh, and their hands are already reaching for the handcuffs. You don't understand what's going on. You're sure you've done nothing wrong. But the system? It's already made up its mind. That's exactly the dire situation Kiana Moore found herself in. She'd been accused of a massive fraud she didn't even know about. Now she had to face irrefutable evidence, a ruthless prosecutor, and a legal system that didn't seem eager to get to the bottom of it. But just when things seemed hopeless, the truth began to surface. On the day Judge Camille Robinson read the verdict, there was a sepulchral silence in the room. Harper's face was tense, sweat dripping down his forehead. The court clerk handed the verdict note to the jury foreman. Camille looked at them and asked a single question. "Jurors, have you reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply. "On the charge of willful infliction of grievous bodily harm, what is your verdict?" "Guilty." The foreman's voice echoed through the room. A restrained sigh echoed through the room. Camille shifted her gaze to the defendant, watching the flicker of fear and shock on his face. She continued, "On the charge of official misconduct?" "Guilty." Harper tensed. His attorney looked grim. Camille thanked the jury and announced that the session would continue for sentencing. All this time, Harper kept his eyes on her, a mixture of incomprehension and growing rage in his gaze. The trial was over, but the story didn't end there. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding comment. Attorney Lowe said briefly that the verdict was an important step toward justice. Harper's attorney hurriedly led his client away, refusing to comment. But the cameras did capture the moment, and the next day the headlines were blazing with the headline: "Officer found guilty of abuse of power in high-profile trial." Harper was temporarily released on bail pending sentencing, but the prospect of jail time lay ahead. The police department, under intense public scrutiny, issued an official statement emphasizing that officers who broke the law would receive the punishment they deserved. That wasn't the biggest shock to Harper, however. On the day the verdict was announced, he stood before Judge Camille Robinson and suddenly realized who she was. His eyes widened at the sudden epiphany. "Wait. I know you," he blurted out. A roar of indignation and surprise swept through the room. Camilla kept her composure, though there was an uncomfortable tightness in her chest. He could have revealed her past. Harper's attorney immediately jumped in. "Your Honor, we move to invalidate the trial. There's a clear conflict of interest here." Camille calmly folded her arms. "The time for such statements has passed. If you had any doubts about the objectivity of the court, you could have raised them earlier. The jury has reached a verdict based on the evidence presented. Your motion is denied." Harper was boiling with anger. "You set me up. You've been against me from the beginning." Camille looked at him calmly. "Officer Harper, my personal feelings are irrelevant. The jury evaluated the evidence and reached a verdict. That's how justice works." The prosecutor's office pushed for a harsh sentence, citing the severity of the crime and abuse of power. The defense tried to soften the sentence, arguing that Harper had faithfully served the community for years. Camille had a fair judgment to make. She eventually sentenced Harper to 3 years in prison/2 years probation and ordered him to pay restitution to victim Malcolm Harris. In the courtroom, Malcolm was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief, feeling that justice had been served. Pictures of Harper in handcuffs went viral in the media. Half the town cheered, seeing that the law could be fair even to police officers. The other half accused the court of bias. But one thing was clear: the officer who thought he was invulnerable was now going to jail. Camille returned to her office feeling relieved, but also sad. She wasn't happy about the verdict, but she knew it was necessary. Soon she wrote a letter to Malcolm, expressing sympathy and support without attracting the attention of the press. She later learned that internal affairs had begun to receive more complaints about Harper. This process may have set in motion larger reforms. The city began discussing new police oversight measures, the creation of independent oversight committees. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step forward. Camille continued to work, remaining an impartial judge. But in quiet moments, when no one was watching, she allowed herself to feel a sense of satisfaction. Once she had been the one to stop Harper. Now she was the one who passed judgment on him. Was it irony? It was justice.